But now let me introduce to you Mr. Thorsten Reitz, founder and CEO at wetransform. Thorsten has wide experience in research and development, both in academic and business domains. He works on data-driven design and transformation tools that make Inspire possible. With Thorsten's help, many of us has been able to publish Inspire web services, and he most likely has also ideas for future of Inspire. We are pleased to have you here on stage, so welcome, Thorsten. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm very happy to be able to take this opportunity to talk to all of you, and share a little bit of my thinking about where Inspire could be headed and where it should be headed from our perspective as a company. So let me see. Some magic will happen in a moment.
Yeah.
As we can see, dark magic. Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, so, well, we're all a group of experts, and from time to time it can be a bit hard to explain what actually we are doing and why we are doing it, right? So that's been a recurring topic, especially when we think about how can we approach users of the infrastructure that we're building. Yeah, and I was talking to my kids on the weekend, and they asked, so why are you going to Helsinki? What are you going to do there? What is your work? And you have to know, before I continue, that they are currently really big fans of a show called Avatar, The Last Airbender. Not sure, does anybody of you know that? Yeah? Very good. So you might already get a feeling where this is going. And so they were basically like, okay, you're doing the same thing as that guy, because what that guy is actually doing is learning to manage, to bend the four elements. That's basically water, wind, fire, and earth. So, oops, sorry. This is a bit more shaky than I expected. So basically what they heard was all these examples, all these different types of data that we're working with, representing really the key essence of our environment. And for them it was really interesting to put this into this perspective and to say, and you're mastering that, right? So you're mastering all these data elements, and then you can do something with that. Yeah, and that something is what I want to talk about today. And I would also like to give you a very quick intro why I think it's relevant to us as a company and why we are convinced we should be contributing to that cause. So I guess most of you have heard of wetransform in some form or another, but anyway, I would like to give a very brief background for those of you who haven't. So we are a relatively small company, founded as a Fraunhofer spin-off about 4.5 years ago. With 10 people right now, and we are focused on, at this point, at supporting spatial data infrastructures across Europe, basically, plus some extra projects. There is quite a wide range of partners and customers that we've established, that we've been working with. So right now, for example, we're actually publishing Inspire services for almost 290 organizations, many of them municipalities, but many of them also on a national level. Most people probably know us for Hail Studio, for the open source ETL tool that we started to develop about 13 years ago, and for our open platform solutions. What's to us really important, why we said, okay, we want to build up a company around what was then still just Hail, Humboldt Alignment Editor, was that we said, okay, we see that Inspire is kind of a long game, but it needs proper tools, it needs proper support, basically, also from the industry in terms of providing methods and software to really make it happen. And we decided that we would build up a team with the mission to make our customers' data truly interoperable and thus more valuable, and basically assist this group and others in building up Inspire. Now, the key thing for us is to really make open standards work. And the way that we see this is that we need to have like 3 little points where we can make that happen. The first thing is that we actually need to improve the design and implementation of standards themselves. So you've seen that maybe 10 years ago, a lot of the work that was still done in standards design was very much committee-based, very academic, very theoretical. And OGC and many others group are already transitioning to a more data-driven, more implementation-driven, shorter iterations, etc. approach. So that's already a very important point. The second point for us is we also need to be sure that we actually build up robust and effective data infrastructures. So you probably know that maybe 10 or 15 years ago, hosting a server was still kind of an arcane experience where you had to manage a lot of moving parts and so on. And now in the age of cloud, of scalers, of hyperscaling, even of platform as a service, we can have completely different tools at our disposal to make that happen. So that's what we want to leverage. Yeah, and finally, for us, we also always thought that for these open standards, for these typical, more complex models that really represent complex real-world scenarios, be it geology, be it observations and measurements or something else, we also need a tool set that really makes that easier. Yeah, that's basically what we came into the scene to build up. And the reason why we're doing that is basically because we see Inspire as an open platform model. And yeah, this is a term that some of you might have heard, but I think it makes sense if I dive a bit into that and explain what a platform model is and what can make it successful. Yeah, so first of all, I think most of you are familiar with platforms as they exist today. So we have some really successful platforms, some that have some problems as well. But all in all, what platforms typically do is that they enable demand-driven growth. So instead of having a certain supply, you say, okay, I have a demand, for example, for vacation rentals in a city like Helsinki. And at the same time, there's an underutilized resource. In this case, it might be apartments. So there's many apartments that might not be fully used. And I can connect those two via a platform. So that's basically the key of what a platform can do. Be it for private cars or, in the case of Inspire, for geospatial data. So my first core hypothesis is that public geospatial data is severely underutilized as of today. It's also important for a platform model to understand that there are certain value units that are being acted on in every platform. So for example, for Airbnb, it's quite natural, it's the apartment rental. For Amazon Marketplace, it's the article that you buy. For LinkedIn, there's different ones. And for Inspire, it might be the spatial data set. It might also be something else. Usually, when we look at platforms, we also mean that there are two or multi-sided markets. So that means that you don't just have one actor, like a data provider, putting out something by themselves, but you actually have multiple stakeholder groups. And the typical scenario is you have a platform owner or operator. You have the producers, in this case the data providers. You have the consumers, that would be the data users in our scenario. And you have partners. Partners can be software providers, they can be people who provide value-added services and many other things. And it's also important to realize that one organization can actually take multiple roles in such a scenario. And this is called a platform canvas, and it's also something that we as a business used to actually design our business model and to think about, okay, how are we actually going to use Inspire to build up platform models. Now, in platforms, it's basically always about value generation. So a platform needs to bring together these stakeholders so that we can all generate value and ideally balance it. But that's another point I'll come to in a moment. So platforms provide value to all actors, that's the key thing, but then there's also externalities. So for example here, positive can be for the Park Now example, so that's an application where you can find parking spots without searching for them long, that you have a lower environmental disturbance due to less park space search, so you don't drive 15 times around the block to find your parking spot. However, there's also negative externalities. This can be, for example, that there's more noise due to all the crazy parties going on in the Airbnb, or there is actually a loss of income in some other sector. That's pretty common. And balancing value capture tends to be really important, especially if we want to look at this the long term. So, I mean, I think as Inspire, as a community, we're looking to build something that's sustainable and that will work in a very long term. So we can't kind of say, okay, all the value capture is in one place and not in the other. So let's say, for example, we as a community provide all the services, we do the data harmonization, etc. So there's a lot of effort that we put into this, but in the end somebody else is actually the sole person or organization that benefits from that. So it's also always important from early on to think about what is the value that you need to get out of the platform as a data provider, as a data user, as a software provider, etc. To make this work. Yeah, platform markets have a few more characteristics. So one thing that's really important is that they always have network effects. So network effects is, for example, imagine you have an instant messaging app like WhatsApp and you're the only user. Then its value is maybe not that high. If there are 2 users, that's already nice. So value has increased infinitely. But actually, after that, it also still increases very, very strongly. So the more people come on, the more potential interconnections there are. And that's basically what we see in network effects. And the same thing is true for Inspire. So the more data sets there are, the more solutions there are, the more potential connections I have. However, platforms also tend to have winner-takes-all tendencies. And we've seen that a lot with social networks, with these apartment rental platforms and in many other places. And those can be problematic. So that's another thing we'll look into a bit later. And they will have dynamics between roles. So there tend to be both same-side effects and cross-side effects. So this can be, for example, when people all rate a restaurant badly, nobody will come there anymore. So that's a same-side effect, and the restaurant will go bankrupt. That's a cross-side effect, basically, of the platform dynamic. Yeah, and then there's the question, which markets are actually kind of susceptible to becoming a platform market? And in the literature, there's typically 4 criteria. And if you're honest, most of them actually apply to Inspire in a very direct way. So what we do is definitely information intensive. And we do have unscalable gatekeepers. I talked about that yesterday in our workshop. So for example, if I try to license data for the challenge that we tried to do, I got only positive responses from 5 out of 41 data providers. Many of the others didn't even respond. That's what a typical unscalable gatekeeper would be. The market is also definitely highly fragmented, down to municipal level in many cases. And we have substantial information asymmetries. That means that the user often doesn't have the same amount of information about the data and how to use it as the provider, for example. Yeah, and so what happened already to some degree is that there is partial disruption of the things that we are doing. So as the data provider community, there has already been partial disruption of our market. There have been companies like Here and TomTom and E2World and so on, who've basically built up offerings of high quality, really homogeneous spatial data, because we as a community haven't been able to do that so far. There's also been OpenStreetMap, and quite often the answer that I get was also the same thing yesterday in the workshop, is, yeah, okay, if you're looking for a pan-European data set, use OpenStreetMap, which is kind of a pity because we know very well what kind of additional properties, what value and so on lies in your data sets, and that's simply not reachable right now. Yeah, however, one thing that we also see is that right now in this particular market, while there are a few approaches to doing this in a platform way, so for example here in Finland there's an open geospatial platform, overall it's still very fragmented. And that's true both in a technology side and how compatible they are, and also from how you access them. It's still not easy to get this real overview of what can I get from where in Europe. And yeah, the other question is that's also often kind of unsure how many users there are. So the network effects are not really gripping yet in this space. Yeah, so let's come to kind of the main topic of today, which is the open platform approach. So you probably have also heard a lot in the last months, last years, that the centralization of platforms like with Facebook and so on tends to be rather problematic. It has, of course, some key advantages. So one thing is that when you have everything under your control, you can typically operate it in the most effective way. And also users can use it very effectively. There's exactly one API that I need to access, and I get everything from that. And also, logically, there's one toolset that I use to work with that. So there's maximum reuse of tools and also of processes. So, like, for example, how do I actually work with this data? However, it tends to go towards an operator monopoly. And also these platforms almost always mean there's a very high dependency to the platform. So when you rely on it, you can't do something else. And unfortunately, due to that, there also tends to be low data ownership and control. That can be especially problematic with personal and private data, with health data and the like. I guess most of you would really like to know what's going on with your private data, where is it being stored, what is it being used for. But this is also problematic for many other data sets, environmental and property and tax and so on data. So there's so many things where this plays a huge role. Finally, there also tend to be substantial compliance risks. So, I mean, there's not any quarter, I think, in the past 2 years where there wasn't a major data breach in one of these platforms, or there was some infraction on various laws. So there's definitely a risk that organizations are putting themselves on by working with one central agency that might not have the compliance really at the top of their mind. And finally, there's the unbalanced value capture. So that's the classical problem, I guess, that almost all of the profits are centralized in one place and with very few people, and the actual value generation is not really given enough compensation, basically. However, fully distributed, which is kind of the approach in Inspire. So in many countries, Inspire responsibility goes down to the municipal level, and so we really have kind of the opposite approach. Yeah, we're saying if you have a data set, a digital data set that falls under any of the 34 themes, you are first and foremost responsible for implementing that. Which typically means that you retain maximum data ownership and control. After all, it's your responsibility. You put it out. You can change it anytime you want, do whatever you need to. And you also have operator independency. You can always do it yourself, or you work with a central municipal IT center, state IT center, whatever, or with a company like ours, for example. It also means that you have control over compliance. Doesn't necessarily mean you are compliant, but at least you're able to say, okay, it's my own fault. Some people actually don't like that, I've been said, but well. That means that you can do something about it. I think that's a key message at that point. However, operations tend to be extremely ineffective, so that the cost of the whole infrastructure goes up. And the usage is also far less effective. So when you need to combine data from 50 services to actually run your app and just one of them breaks, it's not going to work well anymore. And unfortunately, the reliability of many services goes down very quickly if you increase the number of services. So it becomes very hard to build reliable solutions on top of a fully distributed infrastructure. Yeah, there's also other things like low tool reuse, so very local solutions in place, low process reuse, so one municipality does it like this, the other one does it like that, and there's not as much learning and cross-fertilization as there should be. And in this scenario, also the value capture, because of these reasons, tends to be very low, like literally 2 orders of magnitude lower than in the other model. And that's kind of bad, so that means that we're not even close to getting what we could be getting. Naturally, there's kind of a middle ground, and that's also being identified in a lot of other areas. So it's not just geospatial. Actually, a lot of this movement for open platforms, for distributed platforms, comes from the social media world, because there it's particularly egregious what's happening to your personal private data, to all your interactions. Yeah, it's being used to influence how you vote politically, what your opinions are shaped like by all kinds of, let's say, not just very well-meaning people or people who just want to sell something, but there's people really playing long power games there. And yeah, what this means is that effectively people are trying to find alternatives. And one of the alternatives is actually to have decentralized web applications where you have a personal data pod, and very much like on your mobile phone, you actually grant access to applications to parts of that, and you can revoke it. They are only allowed to store your personal data in that pod, so you can always directly, without doing a GDPR request or anything, request to see that. And there's far more applications like that, and actually even new internet architectures like Cyan. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of that. So there are really considerations of changing how the internet and how applications built on top of that work. And that's, for me, the first message, actually. I think that this, in the long term, is something that we as a community will also need to take a very close look at and potentially embrace. Yeah, so the second term that I wanted to briefly touch upon is data ecosystems. So I guess many of you have actually heard of that before, and I've also actually been asked before I started preparing this presentation on, what's the relationship? And when you look for what a data ecosystem is, you'll find about 100 different specifications and definitions and so on. Some of them are very centric on companies' internal ecosystems, but generally what you find is that most people say that a data ecosystem is dynamic, new stuff is being added all the time, it's distributed, it has many different heterogeneous sources, it tends to be open, and there tends to be a focus on governance. That means on how do I access what, how do I use what. And there also tends to be a focus on democratization, on sharing, on self-service. But actually, most of that is also true of, let's say, how open platforms are defined. So these articles on data ecosystems usually contrast platform versus ecosystem like this. But to me, in the end, the term doesn't really matter that much. I think what we have in the Inspire case is pretty much on the right-hand side. What we are not that good yet at is definitely democratization and to some degree also the governance focus. So I'll touch upon those in a few moments. One thing that I thought was interesting is that in data ecosystems, they often use these maps to describe, it's a bit like the platform model again, to describe who are the actors, what is the data that's being moved, the value units, etc. So that might be really a useful approach for us as well to adopt and to continue develop Inspire. Yeah, and that brings me to Inspire. So after the theory, we come to the practical application, more or less. Yeah, so one key thing of any open platform is typically that it's based on open standards. So the fact that we have a set of common interfaces that everybody who's contributing to the platform is using is what's really enabling that. But it's not the only thing. We need a few more criteria to be fulfilled. And one thing, and that's really important, is reasonable use conditions and use-specific license costs. So again, this was a topic also of our workshop yesterday. Right now, it's, yes, we have the metadata and it does have usage conditions in it, but actually it doesn't help us a lot as industry. For example, with my co-presenter from ALR Technologies yesterday, they were not able to identify whether they could use the data for the challenge or not from that info, and we always had to request manually whether we could use it or not. It's also important, of course, taking into account security and privacy concerns, that you grant non-discriminatory access. So basically doing exclusive licensing deals is not a good idea if you want to establish an open platform. In the same vein go no controls over participation. So if anybody, a private company, wants to use Inspire to also offer their data, they should be allowed to do that. And that's an important point, of course, is there should be no insurmountable technical hurdles. So that's certainly a point where we all can still get a bit better in making sure that it's really easier and more straightforward to implement the whole thing. Yeah, and if we look at that, we can start to look at the maturity. So we've now established there's an open platform, but how is it actually developing? And maturity is a really important concept because these network effects only tend to come when you cross a certain critical level. And the way that we're looking at that is that we are assessing SDIs basically on these three axes. So is the data accessible? Is it usable? Is it useful? And then we also look at different levels, like, for example, Annex 1 and 2, that's the base data. Is it available on a national level? That tends to be the case. But as soon as you go down and look toward whether it's really made useful for specific cases, it tends to be not the case at this point. Yeah, and what will that bring us? So now we have this open platform. We actually have continued to develop it towards maturity, and we've gone beyond that kind of critical tipping point. And that's really what that will help us to do is to go from a very fragmented way of working in our whole industry today to a somewhat more centralized way. Now, this might be sounding scary to some degree. You will have less control of your own. But on the other hand, this also means that tools will get much better, and they will typically also become far less expensive. So the reason why so many cloud subscriptions cost like 10 euros a month and not 1,000 euros a month. So I still remember, for example, 3D software costing anywhere between 500,000 euros and 1 million euros per year. And that has changed so much because we can actually make it much more accessible. We can have a far larger range of people using it because it's simplified. And that can also happen here with the tools that we are using. And by we, I mean both us, the experts, but also the wider group of potentially every citizen, every business. And the other thing that's really important is that when we use the same data and the same tools, we can also much better share enhancements of the actual processes that we're using day to day. Yeah, and so that's what I think this will enable us to do. So it will help agencies get much better, make more effective decisions, and generally also reduce costs. So let's come to a concrete example. So in this case, I used one of the challenge presentations. So I thought that was also quite interesting because it lends itself to a lot of these potential value units. And here, for example, I picked one of the vacation in the Baltic apps, and we can see a couple of externalities. So if you can directly see this comparison, it will probably increase efforts by authorities to clean up beaches, which might be that they have stricter rules on ships and whatever. So this indirectly drives cleaner beaches. It will also improve infrastructure for tourists to actually get to the beaches. However, it can lead to concentration effects. So that's something we also often see with platforms. So everybody makes their Instagram selfie in the same spot, and then that spot, unfortunately, at some point just is wasted. In terms of the value unit, so for example, the platform operator, they can sell an app, they can sell subscriptions, they can integrate with tourism boards and whatnot. So a lot of potential value there. The data provider provides the data, maybe under a paid-for license, and they also get a lot of feedback on their data usage. Again, a point from the workshop yesterday, that this is really critical to data providers to learn what the data is good for and what it's not good for. The vacationer has easier planning and can also give feedback, which again is the same side effect. So, okay, this place is nice, so I'm going there. And the holiday area maybe gets more business from vacationers coming in, and to some degree also control. So typically what happens in this scenario that they're also used so that the agency can kind of say, okay, but this is a protected site, don't go there, so it's actually blocked from that. Yeah, so that's kind of the open platform model and how it can apply to applications on Inspire. But we're not yet entirely there, so there are some challenges that we're still facing. And there's an overall one, which is really relevant to all industries nowadays. It's part of the digital transformation, which is that there's really an increase in connectedness. So all processes are more and more connected, more systems, more agencies to come to a result. And that means the complexity, but the volume, and also the number of use cases for any given data set tends to go up. And that makes things, of course, a bit harder. But it's really not just for us the case, that's everywhere. Supply chain, logistics, you name it. And one way to solve this connectedness problem is naturally through what we've been doing, through providing a set of open standards that enable us to build a bus effectively, some kind of infrastructure where we're handling all the different integrations across. Implementing that, and again, not just here, tends to be a bit risky. It tends to be a big migration effort. For example, in ERP systems, that's one of the areas where this often fails, or it becomes extremely expensive, literally spending hundreds of millions and then having to cancel the project. So that's naturally a problem that we want to address, and it's also the issues of over and under specification that we often see, at least with initial versions of standards. So those things still have to be resolved, and so those are two of the challenges that we're seeing. On the one hand, making sure the standards are adaptive enough, so they change according to what we learn, how they are used, and on the other hand, also really handling the risks and so on of actually implementing the open standards. Yeah, so, and of course where we're aiming at is basically to lower risks, make it cost effective. So for harmonization in particular, it's always a cost benefit question, whether we do it or not. And to make that faster and more agile to be able to actually react to requirements and to changes. Okay, so one of the things that I want to particularly point out is that for Inspire, I think transparent and effective maintenance is really important. So that to me means that we have a roadmap, so we know what's going to be happening 2019-2021 in Inspire. which standards are coming, which modifications are coming, which fixes are applied. I also think that it's really important to have an understanding of the prioritization. So not just of priority data sets, but also of the other moving parts in Inspire. Like what are the things that we are going to work on that are really going to be pushed forward, and then to hold ourselves accountable actually to also following these timelines and these prioritizations. One thing that's, for example, important is that we need to adopt new standards and technology a bit faster. So we're still using base standards from 2005-ish in Inspire, and maybe that's something that should have been addressed in a long while. So something that I think worked reasonably well actually is moving to GitHub for some of the work, like the GeoJSON encoding that was also presented in a workshop yesterday. And that makes things more accessible, more transparent to a wider community. And I generally think that's a smart move of, again, using a platform, in this case GitHub, to achieve far more outreach. The other thing that I think is also important is to making compliance a tad bit easier. And by that I actually don't mean throwing out any of the specifications, but what would already be really important is to not make compliance as much of a moving target as it tends to be right now. So for example, we probably get 4 requests a month about, oh, my dataset was valid 1 week ago and now it's not anymore. And the same with metadata and so on. So usually what would be really helpful is central stable compliance criteria that are versioned. So I can basically say, okay, this is the criteria for 2019. I'm going to validate against them, even if they have bugs, but that's kind of the gold standard for this year. I apply that and I'm happy with that. It would also be quite helpful to actually apply the fitness for purpose improvements and some other things that have been suggested from the community to make the compliance a bit easier there. Yeah, and then of course there's also better harmonization. Yeah, so here for me the question is many organizations are still not really harmonizing their data, so they perceive it as expensive and not worth the effort. And there's also gaps in the specifications that we run into quite a lot. So for example, actually this point about code lists is one of the main things when we now do work on Annex 3 data harmonization. Then we run into, for example, we do some forest species distribution data set and there's no code list. Then all of a sudden you have a user who can't just transfer their data into an existing schema, but they have to go back to their peer group and work 6 months on designing the code list, basically. And that's a real-world example. So it really slows down things a bit. I would also like to encourage more sharing and reuse of how you harmonize data. So this can be that you have an ETL process in FME, in Hail, whatever. And you really actively share them. You think about, okay, this is likely going to be useful to others, so I'm going to publish it in some way. And what's really effective is also to increase adoption of regional and national standards. Usually, especially when you use the national standard and you keep at the back of your mind that there is Inspire and it has some minimum needs, and you align them to some degree, it makes it really easy to get Inspire for free, so to speak. Yeah, so you implement the national standard and then you get that in addition. Yeah, and finally, there's also higher automation and data-driven optimization. What that means for us is basically that we really aim to take data harmonization as it is today as a highly manual process and step-by-step automate it more and more. So for example, one of the several things that are all implemented already in Hail Studio, in our open source product, are things like alignment merging and transposing an alignment from one schema to another. So there's assistance in the tool that can help you do that. So what that means is that, for example, if you have a transformation project from A to B and one from B to C, you can merge the two alignments and have a new project that goes from A to C. And yeah, there's far more coming. So for example, we currently have a beta tool available on our cloud platform that makes these atomic proposals. So that basically looks at how have other people mapped the same data set, the same target data set, and it tries to find out which of the alignment cells, which of the mappings more or less are best suited to your particular new data set. And that's already working quite well. So for these atomic proposals, we can just click through and basically say, okay, that's how I can solve this problem. Naturally, it's not as important to maybe the 50 best experts, they can also quickly use the tools as they are. But our hope is that it really makes it far more accessible to harmonize data for the other 10,000 or so that also have to do that. Yeah, and ideally, much like in autonomous driving, at some point we get to level 5, so the system becomes better than the human. It doesn't mean it has to be perfect, but it makes less errors. But we think that's, to be honest, that's quite far away still. Yeah, let's see if that works. Oh, okay. Yeah, and in the end, ideally, what we think, what we can achieve, especially in a scenario like this, where there's one standard that many organizations are mapping to, is to really get to that automation level. Yeah, so where you plug in a new data set and it's basically, it's harmonized on the fly and in an automated fashion. I just wanted to give you that as a vision. It's probably 7 to 10 years away. But I want to really, I brought this up because to me it's clear that it doesn't have to be the way it currently is, that it's really an expert activity to harmonize data. It can become far more accessible in the future. Yeah, the other thing that we are also kind of struggling still, is, I mentioned that, is to really ensure that we have a robust and effective infrastructure. So one problem is that many services are actually in the metadata, but they are not accessible all the time, or they go down quickly. So you send one too big WFS request and doom. Yeah, happens all the time, unfortunately. Yeah, so there it's also important to kind of approach this with a long-term view. That means that for today it's probably okay if you do that, but somewhere in the future you should really think about which variant will I use, so which kind of system is really fitting my data and usage volume, so how many users do I expect, what am I willing to invest in it, and so on, and then pick one of the implementation options that you actually have. So they tend to have different sweet spots, as you can see. So the two extensions here are production system extensions and domain system, so in German Fachsystem. So depending really on what you're doing, each option might be viable, of course. Yeah, and I would, of course, also like to say that another important criterion of making Inspire successful, and that still has to happen to some degree, is to really enable European SMEs and startups to contribute fully. And I don't really mean the cottage service industry that many of you are working with, and to some degree that we also belong to, of course. Yeah, we do also provide services and consulting and so on. But if you think of kind of successful IT startups from Europe, they are typically not in the public authorities domain, and they are typically in the either B2B or B2C area. And right now there are really problems, let's say, for example, procurement costs, duration, that tends to be very problematic for startups. Sometimes the selection criteria are things like you have to have had 3 million revenue for the last 5 years. Yeah, okay. There's also often de facto monopolies in individual member states where there's basically one company that's providing everything, be it as a facade for others and so on. But again, that kind of limits bringing innovation to Inspire. That's more like we do it the same way we always did it. The perceived risk is the lowest. So that's something I would like to encourage you to think about. I've also seen a lot of solutions to that actually already. It's just that they are not there in the majority of cases. So for example, there are some innovation procedure types around, like pre-commercial procurement and the like. And that's something I would really like to encourage all of you to think about, whether if you want to achieve something specific with Inspire, whether one of these procedures might not be the more appropriate thing. Another thing that is also often a problem is that, at least for us, public procurement often comes with a contract attached. So you cannot negotiate the least thing. And these contracts often have something in there which is basically like you get paid everything at the end. And for a small company, getting paid after 18 months is kind of a challenge, I can tell you that. Yeah, and of course, the other thing that I would really like to encourage is, again, thinking of the platform model, is to think about long-term partnerships. So you want to work with SMEs, with startups as partners in building Inspire to become a successful framework. Instead of saying, okay, yeah, I'm very careful about that, and maybe I get 1 day of training from somebody, for example. Yep. Oh, 1 minute. Okay, I thought I had 2. All right, then I'm going to come more or less to my final slides. So I think, in generally speaking, what I don't really expect us to change that much is the general architecture, how we understand it. Yeah. So the actual types of network services, the protocols that we're using, the encodings, all that will change to some degree. I really hope so, because in 2030 some of the standards are 25 years old that we use by now. But I think at the core we can still rely on the data specifications and on other things to build up this platform. I think we will be able to leverage other standards a lot, and the beauty of them is that there are so many. But in the end, the question really is okay, so we've solved these things, and what does it enable us to do? And from my perspective, the core still has to be the minimum thing we have to achieve is really that we actually put all the national and international reporting on this infrastructure, be it for challenges like climate or others, the more specific ones that are mentioned here. That's for me like the minimum thing we actually should achieve. So at least for the purpose that Inspire was originally designed, we should be able to do that. I also consider data to be kind of the fifth freedom, and this will impact how we use Inspire a lot in the next year. So you probably know there's an Open Data Directive coming around the corner, which places particular focus on high-value data sets such as statistics and geospatial data. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind, to understand that there is a strong open data movement, and that can play substantially into how Inspire will develop. Naturally, there's also the larger context, the global context. Yeah, we're trying to build a society that acts in a sustainable way and that really develops so that we don't kind of kill ourselves in the end. And for example, one thing that I usually get into a lot is these kind of debates. So somebody sends me that image. Who knows that one? The one on the left? Anybody? Oh, you're lucky people. You never got into a discussion with a climate change denier until this point. So this is one of the pictures they really like to use. And what they don't mention is that the graph ends in 1855. Yeah? Yeah. So the actual temperatures are the blue crosses up there. So that kind of changes the perspective a little bit. But yeah, that's really one of the things that's, I think, very important, and that Inspire can also contribute to, is to really inform public debate with trusted facts. Yeah, and I have a few ideas on how exactly this could look like, but I guess that's going to be for a separate time then. Yeah, there is going to be large platforms being built on Inspire, so you have to see Inspire as the foundation, and then on top there are actually more than one platform. So Inspire doesn't have to be just one platform, it can actually branch out into platforms for solution domains. This can be, for example, one like the national platform, so I chose one example for that, and it can also be for a focused use case, like for example spatial planning, where you can really aggregate much more data, and this is really, really high value information. Yeah, developers for real estate and industry and so on, they all want to have situations like this, where I can actually understand the situation across a country or even all across Europe very well, and then make better decisions how to invest, how to develop things. Yeah, we also, for example, there now come two projects that we've been involved with. One is called Future Forests. So this is about finding out, given climate change, how I can actually pick the right trees for the right location so that they are not going to die in 100 years because of the climate change. And that's really where we're feeding in a very wide range of Inspire data. So that's going to be directly applicable. And there's tens of thousands of forest owners just in Germany. So that's also very helpful. Yeah, and the final one you actually saw yesterday. We did support that from the back side a little bit, so to speak. And I was really happy to see the presentation come together now. And I think this is also a really nice example of utilizing everything that Inspire has to offer to actually build something that really is valuable for a wide range of stakeholders. Yeah, and with that, after a bit of a sprint towards the goal, I come to my final slide, which is that I would really like to encourage to grasp the chances that Inspire is offering us, to see this in the same way that we are seeing it, which is offering up a whole host of possibilities of building both a large infrastructure for many applications, but also domain-specific platforms and applications, unlike they have been built before in Europe.
Thank you, Thorsten, for a very inspiring presentation, and I think it's also very good input for today's panel discussions as well. So, any questions to Thorsten? I'm just looking at our screen.io man
Hello.
Pekka.
Yes, we have currently one question. It's regarding the OpenStreetMap that you mentioned in your talk, that you asked to clarify that what's the problem with the OpenStreetMap?
Well, OpenStreetMap actually is an awesome data set, and it's actually an example of a platform that's working reasonably well. It does have some challenges as well. So, for example, if you look closer at the license conditions of OpenStreetMap services, you will quickly find out that they are rather limited, and then you go to a platform operator to get around them, or you host your own version of it. So that's the first challenge that many are facing. That you can't actually use OpenStreetMap as easily as you might get the impression for all cases. The second thing is usually that OpenStreetMap has a lot of information in it, and you have a lot of derived products, for example, for routing of various applications. But when we look at the data that public authorities have on intelligent transport systems, on spatial planning and so on, there's a lot more information that's relevant for traffic than what's actually in OpenStreetMap. So just saying, so they are not exactly the same. There is often better spatial coverage in OpenStreetMap, and sometimes the data sets are even more current. But in terms of the additional information, we've often seen far more data in the authorities' data sets.
You can also ask live questions.
Anybody? One?
Okay, Thorsten, thank you very much for an inspiring presentation, first of all. Second, what would be the 2 or 3 winning arguments to convince the resource owners to go the direction of harmonization? Because you mentioned that many organizations they are scared to go there. So what is the winning factor for the bosses to give the resources?
Yeah. So the first one is not that positive. It's usually risk management. So this is about compliance risk to some degree. So not all people are really happy to kind of break the law, even in public authorities. And so that's indeed one argument. But risk management has a few more aspects. So for example, something we've actually heard a few times is that people are going to see my data then, and they're going to use it for things that I haven't foreseen it to be used, and they don't feel good about that. So it's often also about kind of discussing that, finding appropriate usage and licensing conditions and other things. So I think that's the first point. It's kind of getting the risk out of the way to some degree. Generally speaking, I must say that unfortunately many of the organizations that we work with are not that let's say potential driven, so they don't look that much at what could this be used for. It actually scares them to some degree. So in many situations it doesn't help us that much to tell them, well, this data could be used for A, B and C. So there the experiences do vary, however. There are some organizations which react positively to that, who are saying, show me the use case and I'll do it. But it's not always the case. So from my perspective, it's kind of a bit, I know it's much to ask, but I would really like to ask organizations for a bit of a perspective shift, to think more about the potentials, the opportunities of opening up their data and really considering it to be an asset in the public light. Which doesn't mean making it free of charge, by the way. So.
Okay, then we have a question about, can you elaborate in more detail how you imagine automatic schema mapping?
Yeah. Actually, that's an interesting topic, of course. I'll try to keep it to 1 minute. But generally speaking, those of you who have used Hail Studio know that it's based on individual mapping cells. So you relate a number of schema elements in the source to one schema element in the target. The schema element can be a type, a table, a property, anything. And these cells, compared to other approaches, they have a big advantage because they are atomic. So I don't need to look at a whole process, like, for example, in a script or in a pipes and filters type process. I can actually look at them in isolation. And at the core, what we're doing is that we're looking at properties of the schema and of the data set to then decide whether a different source schema has similar elements in it to the one where we first created a mapping. So typically we have one or more mappings that we created manually that go from one source to, let's say, for example, Inspire protected sites. And then we get a new protected sites data set, and we basically do an analysis of similarities. So we find for each cell that we created initially what the most similar properties, schema elements, and the data behind that, the instances, actually are in that new data set. And that allows us to transpose a solution. Going beyond that, it's also possible to merge solutions. So if you say, okay, I have something similar, but actually it covers only half the way, but then there's another project which does the other half, I can combine that. So the nice thing about these alignment cells really is that they lend themselves to be reasoned with, to be looking for similarities, and then to combine them. What's kind of the challenge is right now for us is, so I'm saying we can do that on a individual property level already and on a visual type level, but naturally the likelihood of an error goes up a lot when you try to make a whole proposal, like basically without user feedback, without some user reinforcement, to go automatically through the whole process at once. So that's certainly the next bigger challenge. Yeah, I would love to have a big research project and do nothing else than that in the next 3 years, but yeah, I still also need to kind of do some data harmonization in between, I guess.
Okay.
Does that answer the question, or
One more question?
One more.
Yep.
Why does the JRC not do more to encourage development of useful software applications that reward data providers for publishing their data?
I'm not sure if I can answer that question, to be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm always happy to kind of do the non-political answer, but in this particular case, I have to hand it over.
Okay. Well, thank you. Let's give a big hand to Thorsten one more.